Hey, Set Guy here. As you can see, I've got a few buck knives here. This is the 300 series of buck slip joint knives. They started with model 301 and worked their way up to model 334. Now, I've already done a video on my buck 301 and the 302, and I'll put a link below in the description to that video if you haven't seen it. I'm going to be doing a few videos on the knives, the 300 series, the ones I have. They had 19 different models. Like I said, they were numbered from 301 to 334. They skipped a few numbers. I don't know if they had planned on doing more or what. To get a little background on the 300 series, Buck had designed these knives, or they had designed a couple knives, the 301 and the 303. And they contracted with Charade first to make those two knives. And they made the knives from 1966 to 1968. I don't have any of the Charade knives to show you, but I'll talk about how you can tell the difference between the Charade and the other knives. Then after 1968 until 1986, they contracted with Camillus to make the Buck 300 series knives. And Camillus made roughly 17 or 18 different models of the knife. So most of the knives that are out there are made by Camillus, but they have the Buck logos on them. Then in 1986, Buck decided to bring the production in-house and started making the knives themselves, and I'll show how to tell the difference between the Camillus and the Buck knife. And Buck is still making the 301 and the 303 of this series. Now the Buck 300 series is from 301 to 334, like I said earlier. They are making some versions that have wood handles versus the black Valox handles that are on these knives. On the 301 and the 303, they made some other versions with different colors, but they were all the Valox handles. Buck is still making knives numbered in the 300 series, but those are in the 350s and the 370s, and they have wood handles. I'm going to be doing individual videos on all these other knives, but today's video is going to be on the 303. Okay, here's the model 303. Now, as I said, there are ways to tell the difference between the knives made by Buck and the knives made by Charade and Camillus. This knife is made by Camillus, and these two are made by Buck. Like I said, the scales are of, well, this one's black Valox, and then these are yellow and red Valox. Now the knives are a little bit different. If you'll notice the shield, the Camillus has a different oval shape. They're a bit narrower. And then also another way to tell is the Camillus knives have brass liners going down the middle. They only have 2 back springs, whereas the Buck knife has, those made by Buck have 3 back springs. And then you can look at the blades and you see a little bit difference in the blades there. The ones made by Camillus are a bit thinner than the ones made by Buck. And you can also tell by looking at the, see if we can get that. Yep. Look at the tang stamp. On the charades, it would say buck made in the USA. And on the Camillus knives, if I can get that in there, it would have buck, the model number, and then USA under that. There we go. And also on the Camillus knives, you got a much more pronounced swedge on the blade, plus you have the long nail pull. On the ones made by Buck, see if we can get that there, it'll say Buck, the model number, USA, and then next to the model number will be a character that tells you since 1986 the year it was made. And it's got the smaller nail nick, and it's a bit rounded here. The swedge is not as pronounced. Also, the blade steel is a little bit different. On the Camillus, they used 440C, and Buck also used 440C from 1972 to 1986. Oh, I'm sorry, 1981. And from 1981 to 1992, they used, for the blade steel, 425M, which these are 425M. And then after 1992, from 1993 onwards, they're using the 420HC steel. Now, to go over the specs of the knife, your handle on the Buck 303, it also goes by the name of Cadet, but the handle is 3 1/4 inches long. The blade is 2.5 inches long, the master blade, and overall it's 5 3/4 inches long. This knife is made by Camillus, and they made it from 1968 until 1986. Now, I know this knife was made in the late 70s because I bought it in 1979, so it was made sometime in the late 70s. Whereas the yellow knife, based on the code on the knife, was made in 1988, and the red knife was 1989. Now, the blade setup on all three knives is pretty much the same. You've got the master blade, which is a clip point blade, and you have a sheep's foot blade, and then a spade blade. Even though this is called the Cadet, in order for it to be considered a stockman, which this is considered by Buck to be a medium stockman, it has to have the spade blade. So if it's got a pen blade, then it's a jackknife. Well, that about does it for the Buck 303 Cadet, the medium stockman. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. And remember, always be prepared.